All right, here we go again. Good to see you all. Hopefully you did your reading assignment and you're supposed to read Second Chronicles, okay? So I'm trusting that you did that. All right, so but let's go on now then. And let's go into the Chronicles. And as we said last time, to chronicle is to tell the events of the day. So the chronicler, which really is only one chronicle when it first started off, and then later divided into First and Second Chronicles. The chronicler is telling the events. He's telling what was going on in the people of Israel's lives. Now, there's something different about the Chronicles as opposed to Kings and Samuel. And in Chronicles, he's more concerned about the theology. Or let's put it another way. He's more concerned about God's view of what's going on, as opposed to in Kings, where it's a story about the kings and their lives and their consequences of how they lived their lives. So Chronicler is more concerned about the theology. He's more concerned about God's viewpoint of the people of Israel, and then his viewpoint of these various kings. All right, so we're looking at the Chronicles. Now, one of the themes that we find in Chronicles is the national faithfulness is the same as in First and Second Kings and First and Second Samuel. But in Chronicles, they want to look to see how they can enliven the faith of the people in God. Their people were coming back. They were despondent. They had been away for a long time because they had been taken away, but now they're coming back to their homeland. They're coming back to their country. They want to reestablish their connection with Jerusalem, and this chronicler now is trying to help enliven their faith, telling their story. Okay, now the other thing that happens, one of the things we find in Chronicles 2, is that it's the issue of going back to a traditional religious rituals. And not in a modern context, you know, saying the liturgy and so forth, that becomes dry and sometimes rote. But for them to have this religious rituals means a return back to God. Because remember, they were exposed to other gods and other faiths that were not of the God of Israel, or the God of the Hebrews. And so for them to get back to God meant to get back to those things when they were worshiping God in a very true way, which were the old traditional worships. So I'm not a proponent of, well, traditionalism when it comes to worship because that's closer to God. No, they were not worshiping God at all in some cases, and this was bringing them back to a connection to God. So the worship of God in spirit and truth is what brings us back in a relationship to God. Okay, so that's what they were trying to do. Another point that they were trying to accomplish, and that was the unity of the priests and the Levites, that they worked together, that the priests were not above the Levites, they just had a different role. Theirs was to uphold the rituals and give the sacrifices. The Levites were the singers. The Levites were what we call ushers today, or the gatekeepers, doorkeepers, gatekeepers. The Levites were also those who, in our faith, we call trustees, those who took care of the temple and took care of that. The Levites were also the ones who handled the money. And so the Levites had a lot to do with the orchestration, administration, and the help of the priests in doing all those matters that were pertaining to God and the worship of God. Now, another thing that we find in Chronicles is the rise and the fall of faithfulness. And so now I want us to do is start taking a look at how we see this rise and this fall, okay? The first thing we find is in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 7, is that we find something that is very significant. And that is now in chapter 1 of 2 Chronicles. Go to that if you would, please. In chapter 1, and in verse, 7, starting in verse 7. It says here, "That night God appeared to Solomon and said to him, 'Ask what I should give you.' Solomon said to God, 'You have shown great and steadfast love to my father David, and have made me succeed him as king. O Lord God, let your promise to my father David now be fulfilled. For you have made me king over a people as numerous as the dust of the earth. Give me now wisdom and knowledge to go out and to come in before the people, for who can rule this great people of yours?'" So we hear Solomon's humbleness and seeking God. So then God answers Solomon in verse 11, "Because this was in your heart, and you have not asked for provisions or wealth or honor, or for the life of those who hate you, and have not even asked for long life, but have asked for wisdom and knowledge for yourself, that you may rule my people over with whom I have made you king. Wisdom and knowledge are granted to you. I will also give you riches and possessions and honor, such as none of the kings had before you, and none after you shall have the like. So Solomon came from the high place at Gibeon, from the tent of the meeting to Jerusalem, and he reigned over Israel. Wonderful start. Wonderful start. Now, one of the things we find in Chronicles is the focus on the temple. There was much focus about the temple because now, remember now, the temple represented the presence of God. That's where God resided. It was at the Ark of the Covenant, which is the presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant was in the Holy of Holies, and the Holy of Holies was a part of the most innermost part of the temple. So this temple was important. And so therefore the chronicler is emphasizing the importance of the temple because that's where real worship of God happened in that day and time. Now let's go on to something else. In chapter 2, we see that he is preparing to build a temple. Chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, follow along with me. Your translation might be a little different than mine, but it's saying the same thing. Chapter 2 of 2 Chronicles, verse 1. Solomon decided to build a temple for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself. Solomon subscribed 70,000 laborers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country and 3,600 to oversee them. And so then he's going to a massive preparation for the building of God's house that we find here in chapter 2. Now, going to chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, we find him in the process of building the temple. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had designated on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. He began to build on the second day of the second month on the 4th year of his reign. Now there's a key thing that's happening here. The chronicler also has a theme not only of God's perspective and God's view of their history and God's input into their history, but also a sense of unity. The chronicler wanted unity, or to show the unity of the people. And so what we have here, we have David working in concert with Solomon to have this temple built. David preparing the way. This is where David had chosen. This is where David had heard God. And this is where he's going to build the temple. All right, now if we go into chapter 4, verse 1, and 4:1 through 6, we'll find the furnishing of the temple. He made, and this is Solomon we're talking about, made an altar of bronze, 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 10 cubits high. And then he made the molten sea, as was round, 10 cubits from the rim to rim, 5 cubits high. A line of 30 cubits would encircle it completely. Under it was panels all around, each 10 cubits surrounding the sea. There were 2 rows of panels cast, which was cast. Verse 4, it stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set for them. The hindquarters of each were toward the inside. So you can hear the detail that he gives and how specific it is. But now he went through all this very careful, methodical preparation of everything and furnishing the temple. And so we find a whole chapter dedicated just to the furnishing of it. Then we go to 5, chapter 5, verse 2 now. Now the temple has been built, has been furnished. The most important part of the temple is now to be addressed. In chapter 5, starting in verse 2 through 8, we have the ark. In verse 2, then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the temples, the leaders of the ancestral houses of the people of Israel in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And all the Israel assembled before the king at the festival that is in the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the Levites carried the ark, So they brought up the ark, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and Levites, here that joint working together, the priests and the Levites brought them up. King Solomon and all the generation of the Israel had assembled before him, were before the ark, sacrificing many sheep and oxen, and they could not be numbered or counted. Verse 7, then the priest brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. That's where God resided, in the inner sanctuary, and was referred in some of the scriptures as the Holy of Holies. And so if you take a look at most churches, what resembles that then happens to be where the choir is. Happens to be where the choir is, and that's where they are. So there should be holiness that comes out of that. The singing that comes from that should and ought to be holy. Okay, so we find that then now. Okay, so then we have that in 5, that he dedicates it. And then in 7 now, and where we want to go to next, chapter 7, we have God appearing to David, to Solomon. And let's go to verse 12, chapter 7, verse 12. It says, then the Lord appeared to Solomon in the night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command that the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people. If my people, this is one that everybody remembers, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Now what you'll notice in here, there is just finishing dedicating the temple, celebration, everybody's excited. They brought in the Ark of the Covenant. God's presence is there with them. But God now is giving to Solomon here, a veiled warning. Because he says, he heard his prayer. He says in verse 13 again, when I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people, if my people who are called by my name will pray, humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. So I guess God is telling them, here's the potential now. Because things are going good, don't forget that these things can occur, so make sure you stay strong in the Lord with me. So we find that in this warning that God has given to them. So as we said before, the Chronicles, as you can see here in this reading, really focuses on the temple, because this is the presence of God, and the worship of God is critically important to a relationship with God. And that's true today. Our relationship with God, in part, and a significant part, is in our worship. And people will say, well, you know, I know God, I love God, I don't have to come to church. But I'll challenge you on that then. The church is the body of Christ, right? The gathering of the believers. How can you say you love God and not love his son, Jesus? And how can you say you love Jesus if you don't love his body, which is the church? And we realize it's challenging. We realize that things happen and people do wrong things, but still to this day, the church is the physical representation of Christ. And so therefore we are challenged to love the church because it is his body. Okay, a side note, let's get back now to this Chronicles. Now, one thing I wanted to show you here is in chapter 9. Go with me, 2 Chronicles chapter 9 and verses 1 through 9. This we remember, the visit of the Queen of Sheba. But I want to show you something here. When the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test him with hard questions, having a very great retinue and camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. When she came to Solomon, she discussed with him all that was on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions, and there was nothing hidden from Solomon that he could not explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba had observed the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, and their clothing, his valets, their clothing, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit left in her, meaning she was done. I mean, there was nothing else she could say. She was in awe. She was thoroughly impressed, and all that she had heard about Solomon were true. But here's not the part I want to get to. Here's following what I want to have you hear. Verse 5. So she said to the king, the report that was true that I heard in my own land of your accomplishments and all your wisdom. But I did not believe their reports until I came of my own eyes and saw it. But even half of the greatness of your wisdom had been told to me. You far surpass the report that I have heard. And here's the thing, verse 7. Happy are your people. Mine has an exclamation point. Happy are those your servants who continually attend to you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God. She's affirming him, his God is her God now, who have delighted in you and set you on his throne as king for the Lord of your God. Because your God loved Israel and would establish them forever, he has made you king over them, that you may execute wisdom and justice. Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, a very great quantity of spices and precious stones, that there were no spices such as those that the queen of Sheba gave to the king Solomon. He was blessed. Things were going exceedingly well for him. He was admired by people and all those who were around him. And so we find that it's just an awesome thing. But I want you to see something, and this is very significant. Go to 1 Kings now. Go back to 1 Kings and go to chapter 11. Kings 11 and 1. Kings 11 and verse 1. King Solomon loved many foreign wives along with their daughters and Pharaoh, and he marries these wives. But what I want to do is bring you down to the latter part of that. Let's say go down to verse 9. Then the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this matter, that he should not follow other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenants and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give that to your servant. Yet for the sake of your father, David, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hands of your son. I will not, however, tear away the entire kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Okay, our time is just about up. But what I want us to be able to understand here, you have about 5 more minutes? 15? Okay, we can keep going. I just got a cue from Eugene here. We got some time. Okay, so what I want us to see here is that what happened is that it's because of Solomon that we see what happens later on. It's David or Solomon who sets up what happens to the people of Israel later on after that. Okay, it's because of these wives that they took his heart away from God, and he compromised and he went with them instead. Okay, now let's now go back to 2 Chronicles, because we're going to see the consequences of what happens here. In 2 Chronicles chapter 10, go there if you would too. 2 Chronicles chapter 10, starting in verse 1. 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 1, the resulting of what happens here. Now, this is Rehoboam. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. Now, remember in 1 Kings here, he said he will not take it away from Solomon. He will take it away from his son. And this is the son, Rehoboam. Chapter 10, 2 Chronicles, verse 1. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Rehoboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Rehoboam returned from Egypt. They sent and called him, and Rehoboam and all Israel came and said to Rehoboam, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, and he placed upon us, and we will serve you. If you just lighten our load, Rehoboam, if you just lighten our load that your father put on us, because Solomon had subscripted people into near slavery to do all these building projects. And so then we find here that they're just asking for some easing up. And he said to them, verse 5, and he said to them, come to me again in 3 days. So the people went away. All right, now verse 6. The king Rehoboam took counsel with the older men who had attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how do you advise me to answer these people? They answered him, if you will be kind to this people and please them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. They're giving wise counsel. But now, verse 8, and this is a part many of us remember, but he rejected the advice that the older men gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and now attended him. What he did here is he didn't listen to the wise counsel that his father had accumulated that allowed his father to do and accomplish what he was able to accomplish. But he listened to these other young nobles, because he was a young noble, who had probably been spoiled and doted over and did not have to struggle like their fathers did. And they're the ones who's now advising him. Okay, so anyway, we go on now. He says in verse 8, but he rejected the advice of the older man and gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and now attended him. He said to them, what do you advise that we answer these people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father put on us? The young man who had grown up with him said, thus should you speak to the people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions. You kind of figure out what in the world was on his mind. You know, his father gives him this great kingdom, has all this wealth, has this wisdom, but there's something wrong. Something disconnected here. Verse 12. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day. Jeroboam coming back down to find out the answer. As the king has said, come to me again the third day. Verse 13, the king answered him harshly. King Rehoboam rejected the advice of the older men. He spoke to them in accordance with the advice of the young men. His father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to it. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, because it has turn of affairs brought about by God, so the Lord might fulfill his word, which he has spoken to Ahijah, the Shalamite, to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Then all of Israel saw that the king would not listen to them. The people answered the king, what share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Each of you to your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David. So what he's telling them here, they're saying here, go back to the tribal ways. We have no inheritance with Jesse, which is the father of David. We have no inheritance with David. We are not a part of that, and therefore we'll go to our own ways. Now what is so significant about this is that now the kingdom is split. And from this point forward, they are two different kingdoms. And from this point forward, they are weaker to their enemies. They're more vulnerable to their enemies because they are divided. Remember, a house divided is one who is subject to all kinds of outside threats and harm. And so therefore, unity, as the chronicler is trying to show, unity is so, so important. And if there's division in your home, if there's a division in your relationships, do what you have to do. Apologize even if you don't feel like you should apologize. They owe you an apology. build and work at building unity in your family, in your church, in your relationships. It is worth the effort because the power of unity is an awesome thing, but the weakness of division is always apparent. Okay, now we got a little bit of time to go through some of the kings that happened. So we find out here is one generation can set up another generation, as David did. He set up Solomon for good. Or a generation can set up a following generation with significant challenges. And that's what Solomon did for the people of Israel. Okay, let's go through a few of the kings and to finish up our time here. If we go to 2 Chronicles chapter 14, we have started listing some of the kings. In 14, we have Asa, and Asa reigned. And Asa was a good king. And so we find that in 14, verse 1, so Abijah slept with his ancestors, and they buried him in the city of David. So his son Asa succeeded him, and his days in the land that had rested for 10 years. Asa did what was good and right in the sight of his God. And he took away the foreign altars, the high places, broke down the pillars, hewed down the sacred poles. Good king. We find a good king in Asa. Now then, we have, let's go to Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat chapter 17. Go over there if you would, please. Jehoshaphat chapter 17, verse 1. So the son Jehoshaphat succeeded Asa, and strengthened him against Israel. He placed forces in all the fortified cities of Judah. He set garrisons in the land and the cities of Ephraim that his father had taken. The Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the early ways of his father. He did not seek the Baals, but sought the God of his father and walked in his commandments and did according to the ways of Israel. Good king. So we have some good kings. We have some bad kings. Jehoshaphat was good. We have Jehoram, which is a bad king. You go to chapter 21, you'll find that he was a bad king. You have Ahaziah, bad king. You'll see him in there. Athaliah, another bad one. You have Uzziah, which is a good one. And he started off good. Now, we don't have time to go through that, but in chapter 26, read that if you would. Chapter 26, verses 1 through 4, we find out how he started off good. But then by the time you get to verse 16 in chapter 26, he's gone bad. Manasseh, on the other hand, which is really intriguing as you follow through the Chronicles, he started off bad, Manasseh in chapter 33, verses 1 and 2, but then he ends up good by the time you get to verses 10 through 14. So what we're trying to say here is that we have a choice. We can live for God and with God. We can live according to his commandments and his ways. We will be blessed individually, but most importantly, we'll set up the generations after us to be blessed. But then every generation, as we see, has to make their own decision, where you can bless your child and teach them all the ways of the Lord, but then each generation has an accountability that they have to decide. Am I going to continue on the blessing, or am I going to revert the problems that were handed to me into a blessing? So in that Deuteronomy account of the Ten Commandments, God says that I will visit iniquities of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who deny me. But the next part, but I will bless for 1,000 generations for those who love me and follow my commandments. My charge to you, my encouragement to you is to do that. Set up a blessing. Take what was handed to you, good or bad. Follow the Lord and make it good for both you and your family and your individual life, and most importantly, for the generations to follow. God bless you. Take care. We'll see you the next time. Continue reading. Continue being blessed. And we hope you're getting a blessing out of this. All right. Take care. Goodbye.